Hi students, this video is going to take you through 5 devices that you will need to be familiar with when reading Beowulf. So the one that we're going to start with is kenning. So a kenning is a compressed metaphor or description using 2 nouns to describe a subject, place, or object. So what does that actually mean? Well, a kenning is when you take a word and instead of using that word in a sentence, you use a compressed metaphor. So for instance, here, fire could be red flower. You could see that as a metaphor in a sentence. The fire was a red flower. However, that's not how it's used when it's a kenning. When you use it as a kenning, you would instead say, the red flower consumed the house. That would mean the house burnt down. So that's how kennings work. Another example would be instead of saying death, you would say sleep of the sword. Or instead of saying the sea, you'd call it whale road. Now, Beowulf, being oral poetry, uses quite a bit of kennings throughout. You're going to see them kind of everywhere. So some examples that you're going to see in Beowulf is such as the gold shining hall refers to hear it. The guardian of crime refers to Grendel. The strong-hearted wakeful sleeper refers to Beowulf. Cave guard and skyborn foe refers to the dragon. So as you can see, places and people are oftentimes referred to by kennings throughout the epic poem. Therefore, you're going to need to make sure that you're able to keep track of these kennings so that you can keep track of which character they're actually talking about. Now, why use kennings? The purpose of kennings become very clear here. Based upon the kenning, you can see how we're supposed to feel about this place or about this person. So for instance, gold shining hall, using that kenning to refer to hear it, tells us that this is a beautiful, very wealthy place. Similarly with Grendel, guardian of crime, we know we're not supposed to really like Grendel because he's a criminal. So the purpose of kennings is to provide more information as to how we're supposed to think about a person, place, or thing when reading. So now let's move on to alliteration. So alliteration you're probably familiar with is the repetition of initial sounds in neighboring words. Allie ate apples all afternoon. However, we also see it in a less silly manner in a lot of different writings, such as Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. While I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. Now, a common myth about alliterations is that the words have to be exactly next to each other, and that's not the case. Alliterations can occur within a sentence where there are different words spacing them out. It can even occur between 2 different sentences. So, for example, the deep churned. Something had happened down in the dim, foggy green depths. Here we have a clear alliteration, the repetition of the d sound. But notice that the words are not directly next to each other. They do not have to be next to each other. They just need to be in the same vicinity. So what's the purpose of an alliteration? Well, firstly, it emphasizes the words or ideas that are being alliterated. When we read alliterations, they jump out at us, and we're more likely to pay attention to them. It can also create a contrast of ideas. So if you have 2 words that mean very different things, but you start them with the same sound, the contrast becomes even more evident. And last but not least, it creates a melodic effect and it rolls off the tongue and sounds pretty. Now let's move on to the word assonance. So assonance is the repetition of identical or similar vowel sounds in a series of words, phrases, or syllables, such as clap your hands and stamp your feet. We have the ah sound. There's also try to light the fire. There's the I, and then the it beats, as it sweeps, as it cleans. So it has the same repeating vowel sound. So some examples in literature are slow the low gradual moan came in the snowing, and also shall ever medicine thee to that sweet sleep. So we can see how assonance, very similar to alliteration, creates this very melodic sound. You can see assonance kind of luring people to sleep. It creates this peaceful kind of lullaby. However, it's also used for emphasis. Now, in Beowulf, hopefully in the translation we'll be able to see some different instances of assonance. But in the original version, before it's translated, it is very apparent. So I'm going to do my best to read this, but it's in Old English, and that's not really my best skill. So, in a summer season, wone soft was the sun. I shop me into a shroud, as sheep as I were, and habit of a hermit, unholy of works, wend I wind in the world wonders to hear. So, As you can tell, in the Old English, there's a lot of assonance in Beowulf. However, in the translation, while it's there, it won't be as prominent. So now let's move on to something very similar, but also the opposite, consonants. So far, we've learned alliteration and assonance, and we see that they're all about the repetition of sound. Alliteration being the repetition of the beginning sound, assonance being the repetition of similar vowel sounds, and now consonance is the repetition of similar consonant sounds within the word, such as Jack makes monkey bread for breakfast. There's the repetition of the k sound. We also have an alliteration with makes and monkeys and bread and breakfast, but what we're looking at for consonants is this repeating k, 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 k. So some more examples are, don't eat in that tent. Some mammals are clammy. That's weird. The lumpy, bumpy road. That's also kind of weird. Well, these word examples all show how consonance works. Now let's move on to our last term, and probably the most complicated of the terms that we're going to have in this video, Ceasura. So Ceasura might be familiar to you if you play music because it's used in music. And it's a complete pause in a line of poetry or in a musical composition, and oftentimes you'll see this little symbol. However, in literature, while sometimes that symbol is actually used to show readers that they need a pause, oftentimes it isn't, it's just implied. So for instance, Ceasura can be a pause in a line of poetry that is formed by the rhythm of natural speech rather than metrics. So when you're talking, you naturally pause sometimes, and that's what creates a Ceasura. Okay, so it's the natural pause that occurs in lines of poetry. So here's an example from Sing a Song of Sixpence. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye, 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. When the pie was opened, the birds began to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before the king? So here we can see that the Ceasura has come right by the punctuation, and that's going to pretty normally be the case. Now the reason why it seems so obvious here, but for Beowulf it's so important, is remember that Beowulf was an orally told poem. It wasn't written down when it was first told, it was just passed on from person to person in oral storytelling. Therefore, Ceasura was very important because people had to kind of just pause naturally because they weren't looking at the punctuation. So while visually it looks obvious, in oral storytelling it's not as obvious. Now in Beowulf, we can see Ceasuras located in these lines. So a cum of more under Misselthorpe, Rendell Gogan, Gauze your bear, Mint C see, I can't read Old English, but let's just take a look at it. So here in this Old English, we see these spaces, and they're indicating Ceasura. We're not reading the Old English form of Beowulf, thank goodness. We are going to read a translation, and the Ceasuras will still be located in them. So let's take a look here. Thank goodness this one's translated. And let's look at how it's used in this part of Beowulf. When the Scylding warrior, savage and grim, seized the ring hilt and swung the sword, struck with fury, despairing of life, thrust at the throat, broke through the bone rings, the stout blade stabbed through her fated flesh. So here we can see there isn't actually any form of punctuation to indicate where the Ceasura should come, but we just naturally pause. Now there's not going to be these huge spaces in the text that we read, so you're going to need to make sure to do your best to create this chant-like effect that was intended when writing Beowulf. Alright, so those are the devices that you're going to need to know for our upcoming readings. Make sure you take notes on them. In these notes, you should write down what the device is, how it works, and why authors use them. Alright, I'll see you tomorrow in class. Best of luck. Bye.